Matthew 22, 34 through 46 can be divided into two sections, verses 34 through 40 and verses 41 through 46. And in the first section, the Pharisees are gathered together with Jesus, and one from among them, a lawyer, asks Jesus a question. And in the second section, the Pharisees are also gathered together with Jesus, but Jesus turns the tables and asks them a question. Now, in the first section, the question that the lawyer from among the Pharisees asks Jesus is this. He says to him, "What is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus says to him, quoting Deuteronomy 6, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment. And a second one is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Now, in the second section, the question that Jesus asks the Pharisees also pertains to the Lord. And Jesus puts it like this. He says, "What do you think of the Christ?" And earlier in Matthew's gospel, Jesus has already revealed himself, at least to his disciples, to be the Christ. But here Jesus says to the Pharisees, "What do you think of the Christ?" That is the Messiah or the anointed one of Israel. "Whose son is he?" And the Pharisees say, "The son of David," or in other words, the son of the most famous king that Israel ever had, who preceded Jesus in time by about 1,000 years. And then Jesus says, well, how then is it that David, under the inspiration of the Spirit, says, and here quoting Psalm 110, which is a Psalm of David, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet." And then Jesus says, if David calls him Lord, how can he, or the Messiah, be David's son? And so what Jesus is saying here is that even though David preceded the Messiah historically in time, Jesus, the Messiah, the Christ, ranks ahead of David because he was before him, because he was, in fact, in the beginning with God. And there are similar statements like this in the Gospels. We also think of a place like John chapter 8, where Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am." So Christ is always before us. Now, the name Jesus comes from a Greek word, which is a translation of the Hebrew name Joshua. And in our text from Deuteronomy 34, 1 through 12 from today, we see this Joshua, who in this case came after somebody. He comes after Moses as the leader of the people of Israel. And this is the text where Moses goes up to Mount Nebo at 120 years old. And he's able to look and see the land that God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob, his ancestors. But Moses, of course, will not be able to enter into that land. It's not his work. It's not his appointed task to take the people in. Rather, that task is to fall to his assistant, Joshua, the son of Nun. And even though the text says that Moses' sight was unimpaired and his vigor had not yet abated, in other words, he might still have things to give and works to do, yet in the mysterious workings of time, it was his time to go. In the mysterious providence of God, it was Moses' time to die. And so then the text says that Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands upon him, and that the people were prepared now to follow Joshua. Joshua had what Moses had. Moses had imparted his spirit and his skills and his words and his expertise and all that he knew. He did not hold back from Joshua. And Joshua was ready to lead. The one who came after Moses was ready to lead. Now, in 1 Thessalonians 2, 1 through 8, we see Paul writing to the Thessalonians, which was a church that Paul had earlier planted. And Paul writes to them and says, speaking for himself and Timothy and Silas, so deeply do we care for you that we are determined not only to share with you the gospel or the good news of God, but our very souls or our very lives, because you are so dear to us. So Paul was telling the Thessalonians now, even now that he has left them in person, he reminds them of the fact that he had shared all of who he was with them, and that they were now able, under the spirit of wisdom and through the word of Jesus Christ, to walk in that word and by that spirit and become a witness to the living God and God's way in that place, in that city where they were. And so, in effect, it was not necessary for Paul to be there in person with them anymore, even though he still had things to give and works to perform. But it was not appointed to him to stay there in Thessalonica and shepherd that church in person. And God was making provision for the flourishing of the Thessalonian church without Paul, without Silas, and without Timothy. And so we can also be confident in whatever work that we have done for God and whatever work we have done in the spirit of the humility of Jesus Christ, that it will endure, because Jesus Christ himself is before us, and he comes after us by his Spirit to continue the work that God initiated among us, wherever we may be. And so we say, in the words of Psalm 90, we say, "O Lord, you, and perhaps you alone, and you alone, O Lord, have been our dwelling place in all generations, before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God." Amen.